It's wonderful to see you again and to be able to talk about your piece, in vivo. So,
Thank you so much, Mark. This is great. I'm really excited to hear what you've done with it.
yeah, I wanted to ask you how many versions now do you think there are, or how many times have you had people do it either acoustically or make some kind of rendition of it?
I think it's been quite a number of people have played this piece, and
Yeah,
the sort of array of arrangements is pretty large,
right.
which is part of the pleasure because every time I hear it, I'm like, wow, I never thought of doing that,
Yeah.
and that's really fun.
How would you situate this piece in terms of, I suppose, other approaches you've had to writing pieces in terms of sort of openness of ability to interpret it or to
Yeah,
prove
I
it
think in a
further?
certain way, many of my pieces were commissioned for a particular ensemble, but
Hmm.
then going forward, I'm very relaxed about people making arrangements that replace some instruments with other instruments or whatever like that. But that's a sort of ad hoc transformation that happens after having made a specific version,
Right,
right? Whereas the whole idea with this piece from the beginning was was the idea that I supply the performer with a bunch of elements,
right.
and it's up to the performer to decide what to do with these elements, whether to, in fact, subdivide the elements even further, right? Because you don't have to play every note of a particular variation. You can actually subtract notes if you prefer, like it's
Yeah.
okay. You can do whatever you want, really. Um, and so I kind of like that that's built into the concept of the piece
Hmm.
from the beginning. And it changes what my expectations are for an arrangement. I have fewer expectations because people really are invited to make it their own and to play like a girl.
Do you think this is a typical approach of many of your colleagues, or do you find yourself a little unique in that?
Um, wow. Yeah, I don't know how to generalize about my colleagues, right? Because that feels, I don't know, a little strange. But but yeah, I think there's a kind of composer who
Mhm.
writes very specifically for very specific instrumental sounds and colors that contain a tremendous amount of the meaning of what the composer was trying to express when they wrote the piece. And those and there are pieces, for example, with a tremendous amount of articulation and dynamics and instructions that are written by the composer to the performer, right? So that's sort of taking that idea even further, right?
Mm.
And I certainly am on the other side of whatever that is,
Yeah.
in that in that even when I've specified, this is for violin, right? Or I'm not going to have tons of phrase marks and articulations and bowing indications. I'm just not going to do that. I'm going to assume that the piece I've made is conceptually clear enough that the performer, who after all knows way more about their instrument than I do, no matter what instrument it is, even if I play that instrument, I don't play it as well as whoever's playing the piece, right? So my urge is to sort of leave that to the performer because I assume that the performer knows better than I do how the piece should be played beyond a certain minimum understanding of what it is conceptually.
Right. Speaking of instruments, what do you play?
Well, I
And,
I
and I know you sing quite a bit too.
yeah. Yeah, I think I think what I do most is sing and talk,
Okay.
right?
Hmm.
And while I play the piano sort of, I rarely do it in public, you know, as a thing. Like it's just more a utility rather than a form of expression,
Hmm.
if that makes sense. And when I was young, I played first violin and then cello. So I
Okay.
had some experience with string instruments. Um, but after college, that sort of went away.
Hmm.
And I did study sax for a little while
Okay.
because I wanted to know what it felt like to play a breath activated instrument, you
Hmm.
know. So
And anything in the way of guitar, ukulele, banjo?
not real. I mean, actually, recently I made a piece for Quattro that I'm playing myself in the video, but
Okay.
like I'm not much of a guitar or I'm not really a singer songwriter. Let's put it that way.
Well, I think of all these instruments because of your wonderful journey down the Mississippi, and maybe it would be nice for the viewers to hear a little bit about that.
Yeah, in in 2009, I decided to paddle and bike, basically take a human powered trip
Right.
down the entire length of the Mississippi from where it begins in central Minnesota
Mm,
all the way down to New Orleans. And that was sort of a reaction both to the economic meltdown
mm.
of 2008. And so I felt like it was appropriate to do a one person WPA project, right?
Okay.
And also the election of Obama, which at that time, if one can remember that far back, because it feels like, I don't know, approximately
History.
12 lifetimes ago, right? There was that sense of renewed hope and excitement about the American experiment, right?
Mm,
And what that could mean to the country. But it was also a delayed reaction to the horror of Hurricane Katrina
mm,
and to a sense that, and I read this book inspired by Spike Lee's documentary about Katrina, where he interviews the author of this book called Rising Tide,
mhm,
which is about the 1927 flood of the Mississippi
mm,
and how it changed the country, not only politically and demographically, because many, many people left the South and traveled north. It's part of the Great Migration, was instigated by this 1927 flood.
mm,
But also, it changed the world, America culturally, which means it changed the world culturally because you had the blues, you had New Orleans style jazz, and those left those local environments and became urban musics in all these other pockets like
mm.
Kansas City and New York and Chicago and
Right.
so on. um, and so in a way the entire cultural life of the United States was shifted by this flood of the Mississippi.
Mm,
And so I began to realize that what we think of as culture versus nature is, in fact, an artificial binary. It's not really that simple, and that geography and culture are intertwined in really important ways. And so I thought, I need to take this journey and find out what's going on in the country and find out and let it tell me what I want to make going forward.
yeah, that's wonderful. And
So
you spent about how much time?
it was like 4.5 months traveling.
Okay.
And then I stayed away. I went to a succession of different artist colonies so that I would be away from New York City for
Mm,
at least a year. I thought
mm,
it was really important to, because I'd been a New York composer, downtown composer for like, 100 years approximately. And after you've done something for 100 years, it's time to do something different, right?
yeah.
And yeah. So
I've
there's a
heard of,
whole repertoire of pieces that grew out of that journey. And
yeah.
in a way, Play Like a Girl is one of those pieces.
Hmm.
Um, I ended up at a juke joint in Mississippi, in rural Mississippi, outside of Cleveland, Mississippi, which is in the Delta,
Okay.
um, where there was an electric acoustic festival going on, sponsored by, I believe, Delta State.
Hmm.
Um, and and one of the young people there, young men there, said to the organizer that somebody else was being a girl about getting up on the bandstand and improvising, right? And I was so appalled. This is 2009, and this is a person who's, got some kind of an education. I mean, they're a graduate student in electroacoustic music, for God's sake, right? And they're saying, in order to denigrate somebody, that they're being a girl. I was like, oh no, like,
Right.
no. I was so enraged, and not even enraged, sort of more like heartbroken. It just
Hmm.
sort of felt like, wow, I thought that kind of dismissive misogyny was at least out of style, you
Hmm.
know? But I was wrong. And so that was the instigation
Yeah.
of this piece. Yeah.
What are you involved with right now that you can tell us about?
Hmm. Right now I'm starting work on a piece for 24 acoustic basses in
Okay.
a grove of trees.
Oh, beautiful.
And that'll be premiering in September here in Brandon, Vermont. And I'm really excited about that. And we're actually encoding um, birch bark
Hmm.
and letting that become the piano roll notation
Okay.
for the piece. Because if you think about birch bark, it looks like piano roll
Exactly.
notation, right?
Right.
And so we're working on that. I'm working with the composer Matt Sargent, and Robert Black is the organizer of all these 24 bases. So that's really fun. And and I'm doing a little piece about Mammoth Cave in Kentucky.
Hmm.
So as soon as I'm 2+2 vaccinated
Right.
next week, I'm going on a road trip and visiting some elderly relatives, and then going to Mammoth Cave, Kentucky to see what I can see for that piece. So there's that. And then I've become obsessed with Emily Dickinson.
Uh-huh.
She's sort of been my role model
Hmm.
for how to flourish in isolation, or at least my role model for how to attempt to flourish, I will say, in isolation, because I have not written 1,700 poems in 5 years or whatever it is. Um, I mean, she was incredibly, incredibly fecund,
Hmm.
Um, um, but I'm in small town New England, like she is, and my house overlooks the main street of town. I mean, the house in town,
Hmm.
and and I'm certainly not the Belle of Amherst, but there's a sense that she has something to teach me
Hmm.
about how being in the same place for a long period of time without a break, and having one's relations be long distance. Hers were by mail, right?
Hmm.
And mine are by Zoom, you
Yeah.
know. Uh, but there's a certain, shared energy, I think, to the way of living.
Right.
Um, and so to really delve into Emily has been life changing for me, and it's inspired various pieces in progress as well as completed that that have been really fun to work on, you know.
Yeah, I
So
think she remains an endless source of inspiration for all kinds of artists, and
yeah,
it's a wonderful model to see what one person does in a way kind of against the world. She's following her own voice, the inner imperatives of production. But I find you too are incredibly fecund, and this leads me to ask you a little bit just to mention about your Book of Days, which is your collective um, kind of channel or whatever you want to call it. Not channel, but I mean it's a newsletter of sorts. That
Yeah, it sort of started out as an idea of a sort of commonplace book brought into contemporary times.
hmm
So instead of being or a book of hours, right?
right,
Like those medieval things that celebrate the saints' days that go around in circles, and have illuminated, you know,
exactly.
images as well as words. And so it started from that idea that there would ultimately be over my lifetime's work,
hmm
there would be 366 pieces, one for each day, that would always start from a text. And then and the text would not be written by me, it would be collected from the world somewhere. And then I would make a piece of music for it. And then there would be some sort of visual element, whether it's a still image or a video or an animation, something. Um, and so far there are something like 142 pieces. So I'm not yet halfway, actually. Um, but but and and there are more every year. And then what I did was I made a mailing so that you can sign up to receive it either every day that there is one, so that
hmm
you just get one each time I send it,
mm,
or you can sign up to get four at a time. So you're not getting quite as many emails from me.
right.
Um, and and it cycles around. And the idea is that each time you arrive at April 17th, you will experience the piece differently. You'll be a different person because it's a
hmm
different April 17th, but also often I'll put in a different performance. So even if it isn't a new piece, it's constantly shifting, it's constantly changing because I'm constantly adding and subtracting different performances. So and Play Like a Girl is actually in every 13th of the
13th,
month.
that's right. Yeah.
Yes, because I realized there were so many potential variations that it wasn't fair to just have it in once a year, because
Yeah,
we'd never sort through. So with your permission, you see, we'll be able to select
of
one or
course. Yeah.
more of the myriad variations. I want to hear about what the process was for you of because you're doing 8 variations, is it?
Yeah, in other words, I deconstructed your layers, of which to explain to the audience your inspiration from the Bulgarian song brought forth 8 layers of music that you call, in some sense, a variation, but they can all be played together, stacked. And I'd thought about stretching them out one by one, not exactly in a certain order, but that sometimes there is a combination of, let's say, one of the pulse tracks and um, maybe the fifth variation, and then maybe as a latent background, you'd have the first variation as a track, and then something more active going on beyond that. And I have to say, maybe it's a little corny, perhaps, but I think of it as a prelude is the first piece. Then the next several movements, there are 6 of those, and then there's a finale, and the finale brings forth all of the layers at once. And I've speaking of the sax, I did use the sax for one of the voices, and um, then working with our friend Hunter Oakes, we created a track that used various synthesizer sounds to embody your variations. And in the prelude, I tried to first I focused just on the pulse, and then at the end of that movement, which is approximately 3 minutes, uh, I sort of tapered it down so we didn't quite get the full climax that you get of the song.
Mm-hmm.
So it wouldn't quite give the full Monty yet. And then I give it, what I was going to say was the corny part maybe is that I give snippets of each of the variations as a kind of foretaste of what's coming. And I do play the part of the variation where it does happen in time, but then I had drop a few notes out of one, or I at one
Ah,
point I only use 4 bars of one, but they do happen in the sequence of where they would happen in their own time.
got it. Got it.
And so it's a kind of concertato idea, and most of the time I'm playing the piano, but I do actually do the more song-like one in on the melodica, which
Cool.
really feels like the kind of reediness of the women's voices. And then the toy piano is used, and I decided just to use each of them once to make them a little more special. Um, and then finally we get my the next to last movement. I start playing the pulse, and then
Great.
leading in finally to the final movement. And obviously, these are movements that are, I think, once people kind of start hearing it from segment to segment, they'll begin to feel where these points are.
Right.
But
Right.
because
Well,
your original segment is about what 2 minutes and 54 seconds or something like that, so it's almost 24 minutes long.
yeah.
From a very pragmatic standpoint, it also allows for a long piece to cover some time and to give me a chance to kind of settle in. And then I kind of want to say part of my performance has already happened in as much
Uh-huh.
as working with Hunter, figuring out timbres, asking him, let's suppress this, or let's bring it up here, or I need to have another sound that I'm trying to find the right, whatever, xylophone or something. And so it may not be quite the right nomenclature, but I feel like that's a part of the process that is performative in a sense that in collaborating with your material, I've already had some kind of performance. And now
Interesting. Yeah.
the final hurrah, then you'll see the front end of that. I mean, or whatever, the public face of that.
Yes.
and and yeah, so I'm also really looking forward to having people's reactions and letting them revel in your piece. I had also, as I put in my program notes, I didn't really want to let go of that song so quickly. So it really encouraged me to expand on it. But for the people out in the ether sphere, Eve has written a lot. I mean, has made transcriptions and adjustments, or not adjustments, revisionings of the material, even at different tempi um, and different layerings, and that is inspirational too.
Yeah. And my goal with that is to make it clear that performers are welcome to do that as well, that it doesn't have to be precisely at whatever it is, 120, so that it's 3 minutes
Yeah,
long. It can be,
right.
4 minutes long if you want to slow it down. Um, And you can, and the pulse ones, what you're calling the pulse ones, which are sort of moto perpetuo,
Right.
can be hocketed or split apart in curious ways that would make them feel less pulsy.
Driven. Yeah.
Yeah. And more sort of broken apart in some interesting way. And it's up to you, you know. Um, what's, yeah, it's, you're doing exactly what I was hoping. I mean, it's so great because the original commission,
Right.
you know, was meant for, I think it was an hour-long show,
Okay.
but they didn't have the funds to commission an hour-long score, and they weren't sure that it was always going to be performed in an environment that had a full-size piano.
Mm.
And yet the woman who commissioned it was a pianist, so she
Right.
certainly want, and that's how this whole thing happened, that it was sort of like, you can play it on toy piano, you can play it on synthesizer, you can play it on whatever combination, and you can do as many variations as you want, right?
Right.
So I mean, you're for a concert setting, I
Mm.
believe 8 variations, you're going to be the max, right? I think most
Right.
people do like a 9-minute piece, 3
Sure.
variations,
Yeah.
right? Or 3 segments, let's call it, because the terminology is tricky. We don't have a way, because there are 8 uh, individual variations that can
Yeah.
be played in any combination.
Hmm.
And so, in a sense, there are 40,320 possible different versions you could make of the piece.
Yeah.
And you're doing 8 of them, which
Yeah.
is quite a number, you know? Um, so, yeah, I can't wait. I'm really excited.
I wanted to add a just quick note that just for people who will be watching the recital eventually, because of the needs of the recording process with the video, we opted for there not being a speaker in the room with me. So I'm listening to
On
the track
headphones.
as I play, and then that has been combined. I mean, we hear the combined result. But I would say ideally, I enjoy performing with this kind of combination as if it were a partner on the stage, so that I can
Yes.
really hear the, the vibrations coming into the room.
Yes.
But
Yes.
that'll be for another time.
Yes. And it'll obviously, when we have live audience members,
Right.
of course you want to project your
Ah,
partners into the space, but
exactly.
it's optional when there are no audience members in the space with you. Yeah.
But I've had
Mm.
a wonderful time uh, working, being in this world of yours, and also very admirative of your explorations in all directions. And I enjoy that when speaking again of the Book of Hours, I feel that there is a kind of ongoing dialogue you have with the past and into the future, and or I mean into the present and then future. But you have a link to various traditions from an instrumental standpoint, genres of music, and then this idea of being close to the rhythms of daily life and um, the importance of that, which is something a lot of us have probably lost in this crazy world we're living in.
Well, thank you so much for that, Mark. I mean, that means the world to me, because that is my goal, is to sort of keep that sense of the flow and the both the past and the present and the future all sort of in this cycle that that will be here when we're not here, and and that's a good thing, that's a comfort.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for being part of this interview and giving us a foretaste of what we're going to hear in a few days. And for those who haven't never heard of you before, I invite them all to go out and explore Eve Beglarian's music.
Thank you so much, Mark. I can't wait.